He's mentally sick, Your Honor. He doesn't even know what day it is. My daughter's voice sliced through the heavy, stale air of the courtroom, sharp enough to make the strangers in the gallery flinch. She stood confidently at the petitioner's table, perfectly dressed in a tailored charcoal blazer, every strand of her hair pinned meticulously into a neat bun. She looked every bit the successful, concerned daughter, the picture of perfection, while I sat alone at the respondent's table silent, accused, and already judged by everyone in the room. The judge didn't interrupt her. He studied me carefully from behind his elevated bench, then slowly glanced down at a sealed federal file resting on his desk. The kind of file that didn't belong in a simple conservatorship hearing. He leaned forward, his tone dangerously calm, and looked right past her attorney. "Miss Sullivan," he said, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "Do you truly understand who your father really is?" Her attorney stiffened. My daughter's face instantly drained of color, and in that single, suspended instant, her entire carefully constructed case began to fall apart piece by piece. But before we get into the details of how I brought a criminal empire crashing down inside a family court, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from today, and what time is it right now in your part of the world? Drop a comment below and let me know. And after the video ends, please give this story a score from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps me grow and tell these stories in a way that serves you better. One last note before we continue. This story includes fictional elements crafted for storytelling and learning. While some details are adapted, the core message about family, betrayal, and justice is meant to be deeply meaningful and useful to you. The room smelled like old oak, floor wax, and stale coffee. Courtroom 506 in the Cook County Courthouse. It had high ceilings, heavy wood-paneled walls, and the kind of imposing cold architecture designed to make a man feel small. The kind of place where justice was supposed to happen, but where lives were more often quietly destroyed. I sat at the defendant's table, wearing the gray wool suit Elizabeth had bought me 10 years ago for our anniversary. A navy blue tie, freshly polished black shoes. I looked like a man who had his life together, a retired professional enjoying his twilight years. But according to my daughter Natalie, I was falling apart at the seams. She sat across the wide aisle at the petitioner's table. 36 years old, exuding an air of corporate success and fragile concern. She looked perfect, natural makeup, composed posture, the kind of daughter any father would boast about at a Sunday barbecue. Except she was here today to completely destroy my life, strip away my autonomy, and lock me away in a facility where my words would mean nothing. Next to her sat Charles Mitchell, her attorney, 54 years old, thick silver hair swept back, wearing a suit that cost more than my first car. He had a deep, resonant voice, the kind of lawyer who could make a blatant lie sound like absolute scripture. He had been talking for 20 solid minutes, laying out his case against me like he was reading a grocery list of my supposed failures. "Your Honor," Mitchell said, gesturing toward me with a gold pen. "Mr. Sullivan has exhibited severe, rapid cognitive decline over the past 3 months. Memory loss, extreme disorientation, frightening hallucinations. His own physician, a highly respected specialist, has officially diagnosed him with early-stage dementia." I didn't move, I didn't speak. I just sat there, my hands folded calmly on the table, watching him perform. Mitchell continued, his voice dripping with practiced sympathy. "He forgets where he lives. He talks to people who aren't there. Just last week, a neighbor found him wandering State Street at 2 in the morning in his pajamas. Your Honor, he couldn't even remember his own address." A low murmur rippled through the courtroom gallery. I caught a few reporters scribbling furiously in their notepads in the back row. This would make a fantastic human interest story for the evening news. Retired tax consultant loses his mind, devoted daughter forced to intervene for his own safety. If only they knew the truth. Mitchell turned back to Natalie with a gentle, fatherly look. "Miss Sullivan, can you describe your father's behavior for the court?" Natalie stood up slowly, her movements heavy, like she was walking to her own execution. When she spoke, her voice trembled beautifully. It was a masterful performance. "Your Honor, I don't want to do this, but I have to." She looked at me, and real tears welled up in her eyes. For a split second, I almost believed her myself. "He's mentally unwell," she said, her voice breaking on the last word. "He talks to my mother. She passed away 3 years ago. He forgets where he is. Last week, I found him standing in the kitchen at 4 in the morning, making breakfast for someone who wasn't there. He thought Mom was still alive." The room went completely silent. Even the court reporter stopped typing for a second. Natalie wiped her eyes with a tissue Mitchell handed her. "I love my father, but he's not safe anymore. He needs help, professional help, and I can't just stand by and watch him hurt himself." I wanted to stand up. I wanted to slam my fists on the table and shout that every single word out of her mouth was a calculated, filthy lie. I wanted to scream that I was sharper than everyone in this room combined. But I didn't, because there was a plan in motion, and the plan required absolute, ironclad patience. I had spent my entire life setting traps for dangerous people, and I knew better than to spring this one too early. I looked up at the judge's bench. Judge Samuel Pierce was presiding over this circus. 58 years old, salt and pepper hair, a stern, unyielding face. He had been reading the case file when I first walked in, and he hadn't really looked at me yet. But then he did. He lifted his head, and his eyes met mine. For just a fraction of a second, maybe less, his expression shifted. A flicker of surprise. Then recognition, he remembered. I had seen that exact look on his face before. 24 years ago, July 1998, Lakeshore Drive. A horrific car accident, a twisted mess of metal and fire. An 8-year-old girl trapped in the back seat, screaming in absolute terror, while her father lay unconscious and bleeding in the front seat. I had been the one to pull over, kick in the shattered window, and drag that little girl out, 30 seconds before the fuel tank exploded and turned the car into a fireball. That little girl was Melissa Pierce, and the unconscious man in the front seat, the man who was now sitting on the bench, wearing black robes and holding a gavel, was her father. Judge Pierce blinked, his face smoothing over instantly, and looked back down at his file. But I knew he had recognized me, and he was choosing to stay silent. He was a smart man. Mitchell wrapped up his opening argument with a theatrical sigh. "Your Honor, we are requesting an emergency conservatorship. Mr. Sullivan is clearly unable to manage his own affairs, his finances, or his basic medical needs. His daughter is fully prepared to assume legal responsibility for his care and well-being." Judge Pierce slowly set down the file. He looked at me, his gaze piercing. "Mr. Sullivan, do you understand the charges and the petition against you?" I stood up slowly, making sure my posture was perfectly straight. My voice was steady, calm, and completely lucid. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand perfectly." Judge Pierce studied me for a long, agonizing moment. The silence in the room was heavy. Then he nodded once. "This court will reconvene in exactly 1 week. I need time to review the evidence presented. Court is adjourned." The gavel came down with a sharp crack. The room erupted into noise. Reporters began talking over each other. People stood up. Footsteps echoed sharply on the marble floor. Natalie sat frozen at her table, staring straight ahead at the wood paneling. She didn't look at me, not even once. I calmly gathered my things, slipped my manila folder into my battered leather briefcase, and buttoned my suit jacket. As I walked past the petitioner's table, I caught a glimpse of my daughter's face. She looked tired, terrified, but nowhere near guilty. Good, I thought to myself, a cold satisfaction settling in my chest. She has absolutely no idea what's coming. I walked out of that courtroom, pushed through the heavy wooden doors, and felt the weight of 47 stairs pressing into my back. Outside, the May wind cut straight through my suit. Chicago felt colder than it had in years. I pulled my coat tight around me and descended the massive stone steps of the courthouse. Somewhere behind me in that building, my own flesh and blood was plotting my total destruction. And somewhere ahead, my counterplan was falling perfectly into place. I just had to survive long enough to see it through. But to understand how a father and daughter ended up on opposite sides of a courtroom, fighting a silent war for survival, I need to take you back. I need to remember exactly how this living nightmare began. 3 months earlier, I was just an old man trying to fill the silence of an empty house. I didn't know my daughter was entangled with criminals. I didn't know I was about to become the target of an elaborate plot to erase my mind. It was a Monday morning in late February. Cold, gray, brutally ordinary. The kind of bitter Chicago morning where the wind whips off Lake Michigan and makes the city feel more like a bleak, black and white photograph than a living, breathing metropolis. I was sitting in my small, cramped office on West Adams Street, reviewing tax returns, when I saw the name that shattered my quiet retirement. I really should have seen it coming. 26 years as an active FBI agent, hunting down financial predators and white-collar ghosts, had taught me to notice patterns. Anomalies, red flags. I was trained to see the invisible threads connecting dirty money to dirty people. But I had completely missed the biggest red flag of my life, simply because it belonged to my own blood. My daughter's company was buried in a thick stack of mundane client files on my desk. Morrison Development Group LLC CEO Natalie Sullivan. My office was small and unassuming, third floor of a worn-down brick building in the Loop. The frosted glass sign on the door read Sullivan Tax Consulting, since 2020. I had opened the business shortly after officially retiring from the bureau. 35 years chasing money launderers, corrupt offshore bankers, and organized crime syndicates. Then one day, I turned 62, and the brass handed me a cheap gold watch and a state pension. They told me I had earned my rest. They told me to go play golf. But a man like me isn't built for rest. When you spend 3 decades staring into the dark corners of the world, you can't just turn off the lights and pretend the monsters aren't there anymore. So I kept working, quietly, completely off the books. The tax consulting office was a perfect cover. It was a way to keep my ear pressed to the ground, track financial crimes, and feed raw intel back to the bureau whenever something major crossed my desk. My handler, though we never officially used that term anymore, was Special Supervisory Agent Diane Foster, running out of the FBI's Chicago field office. Diane was 52, sharp as a switchblade, and arguably one of the most brilliant financial crimes investigators I had ever partnered with. We had worked together for 15 solid years before my mandated retirement. She knew I couldn't just walk away from the chase, so she kept me on. I was a consultant, unofficial, unpaid, and completely deniable. Most days followed a strict, comforting routine. I'd wake up at 5:30 in the morning, brew a pot of dark roast coffee, read the Chicago Tribune cover to cover, and drive downtown. I'd spend 8 hours a day reviewing spreadsheets, analyzing depreciation schedules, and filing tax forms for small business owners who thought I was just a meticulous, slightly boring accountant. They had no idea I was quietly running their numbers through federal databases, looking for the tiny, almost imperceptible inconsistencies that separate a legitimate local business from a massive criminal enterprise. The apartment in Pilsen was too quiet now. Elizabeth had been gone for 3 years. She passed away in March 2019. We never really talked about the illness that took her. She just slowly slipped away one afternoon, like she had been holding on with everything she had, until she simply couldn't anymore. The apartment still smelled like her vanilla coffee in the early mornings. Sometimes, if I wasn't paying attention, I'd catch myself setting out 2 mugs on the kitchen counter instead of 1. Work helped. It gave me a puzzle to solve, something concrete to focus on besides the empty chair sitting across from me at the breakfast table. Natalie and I didn't talk much these days. A quick phone call once, maybe twice a month. We had grabbed coffee 6 months ago at a crowded spot in River North. She had looked exhausted, distracted. She told me she was swamped with her new real estate venture but didn't offer any specifics. I didn't push her. We had grown increasingly distant after Elizabeth died. Maybe that was entirely my fault. Maybe I had spent too many decades chasing bad guys across state lines and not enough time being a present father. She had gone through a messy divorce 2 years ago. No kids. She never talked about her ex-husband, and true to the Sullivan way, I never asked. We kept our pain locked up tight, but that Monday morning as I sat sipping lukewarm coffee, I opened a new client file, Morrison Development Group LLC registered address, 150 North Riverside Plaza. A prime, expensive location. I almost flipped right past it. I would have, if the CEO's name hadn't jumped off the page and punched me in the gut. Natalie Sullivan. I sat frozen, staring at the glowing computer screen. My daughter had never once mentioned owning a development company. She had never mentioned the name Morrison. I pulled up their official website. It was incredibly professional. highly polished. It showcased luxury condos, high-end commercial real estate, massive downtown projects. It was the kind of robust portfolio that takes a seasoned developer years, if not decades, to build. Then, I started looking at the actual numbers. My chest tightened. $500,000 a month. That was the average cash flow, moving rapidly through their primary operating accounts. And it wasn't coming from standard escrow or local investors. It was a series of complex wire transfers from holding companies I didn't recognize. Apex Capital LLC, Riverside Holdings, Blue Water Investments. I quickly cross-referenced the corporate addresses through my backdoor access. Delaware, the Cayman Islands, Panama. My heart hammered against my ribs. Shell companies, offshore blind accounts, extremely high-volume wire transfers with absolutely no clear, legitimate business purpose. I had seen this exact financial web 1,000 times in my career. It was textbook, aggressive money laundering. But this wasn't some nameless cartel boss or corrupt politician. This was my daughter. I shoved my chair back, staring at the screen like it was a live explosive. I tried desperately to think of a legitimate explanation. Maybe she was brokering international real estate deals. Maybe she was working with aggressive foreign investors. Maybe my aging, paranoid brain was just seeing ghosts where there were none. But numbers don't lie, and neither do criminal financial patterns. I yanked open the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a heavy, encrypted burner phone I kept strictly for emergencies. There was only one number programmed into its memory. Diane's direct, secure line at the field office. I hadn't called it in over 2 years. My hands were shaking slightly as I pressed call. It rang twice before she picked up. Foster. Her voice barked, clipped, and professional. It was the exact same tone I had heard 1,000 times during tense stakeouts and early morning tactical briefings. Diane, I said, forcing my voice to stay level. It's Vernon, I need your help. Total silence on the other end of the line. Then the tone shifted. What's wrong? I looked back at the glowing spreadsheet. Morrison Development Group, Cayman Islands. I think my daughter is laundering money, I said. The line went completely dead quiet. When Diane finally spoke again, her voice was completely different. Careful, calculated. It was the specific voice she used when a federal case suddenly became violently personal. Vernon, where are you right now? Don't move. I'm coming to you. Too agonizing. Days later, I met Diane at a crowded independent coffee shop in River North. She had chosen the location carefully. It was public, packed shoulder to shoulder, and completely anonymous. It was the kind of place where nobody remembers faces, and everyone is too glued to their laptops to care about the 2 older people sitting in the corner booth. Intelligentsia Coffee on West Jackson was deafening at 3 in the afternoon. The industrial espresso machine hissed and violently gurgled behind the long wooden counter. Laptop screens cast a pale blue glow across every tiny table. Young, eager professionals talked aggressively about startup deals and looming deadlines over overpriced lattes and iced cold brews. It was the perfect cover, just 2 more corporate drones having a hushed business meeting. Diane Foster hadn't changed a bit in the 2 years since I officially handed in my badge. She still had those same sharp, calculating gray eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She had the same crisp charcoal blazer and the same intimidating, no-nonsense posture. She slid smoothly into the leather booth across from me and immediately set down a thick, unmarked manila folder on the table. No official FBI seal, no classification markings, just raw handwritten notes. Vernon, she said without any preamble, looking me dead in the eye. You are playing with absolute fire here. I had ordered a double espresso. She had a cup of black tea. Neither of us made any move to touch our drinks. She carefully opened the folder and pulled out a few single sheets of paper. It was all handwritten intel, no printed photos, no digital printouts. Absolutely nothing that could be traced back to the Bureau's active databases if someone was watching us. We can't be seen together too often, she said quietly, her voice barely carrying over the coffee shop din. This meeting is entirely off the books. I nodded, slowly. I expected that. When an agent's family gets tied up in a federal investigation, the first thing the Bureau does is completely wall off the agent. Standard procedure. Diane leaned forward, keeping her voice low, letting the ambient noise swallow her words. Morrison Development Group is just one of 15 shell companies we are currently tracking. They're all intricately connected to a massive, highly sophisticated money laundering operation. They are moving anywhere from $50 to $60 million a year through prime Chicago real estate. 50 million. I knew it was big from the wire transfers I had seen, but hearing that massive number out loud made the air in my lungs freeze. At the absolute center of it, Diane continued, her eyes never leaving mine, is a front company called Apex Capital LLC run by a man named Luca Moretti. She slid a single sheet of paper across the smooth wooden table. A name, an address, a date of birth, Luca Moretti, 45 years old, CEO of Apex Capital. And according to Diane's meticulous notes, he was actively laundering tens of millions of dollars for a vicious criminal organization I had spent half my career trying to systematically dismantle. Does that name sound familiar to you? Diane asked softly. I looked at the name on the paper again. Moretti, Tony Moretti. The memory hit me like a bucket of ice water to the face. Tony Moretti, I said slowly, the name tasting like ash in my mouth. November 1999, massive racketeering and wire fraud case. We took him down after an exhausting 18-month undercover investigation. The judge gave him 25 years in federal lockup. Diane nodded grimly. Luca is his son. I stared at her, my blood running cold. He was 22 when you arrested his father, Diane explained. He stood on the front lawn and watched federal agents drag Tony out of his house in handcuffs. And he blamed you, specifically, you. I deliberately set the paper down, pushing it away from me. Where the hell has Luca been since then? Prison, she said flatly. He got picked up in 2005 for aggravated assault and conspiracy to distribute. He served a hard 15 years. He got out in 2020, and since the day he walked out of those gates, he's been quietly, methodically rebuilding his father's entire criminal network. But he's smarter than Tony, quieter, significantly more dangerous. She paused, making sure I understood the gravity of what she was about to say. Luca knows exactly who you are, Vernon. He has been looking for you. I felt a cold, creeping sensation crawl up my spine. And now he's found me, through Natalie. Diane didn't answer right away. She casually glanced around the bustling coffee shop, her eyes sweeping the room, making sure no one was lingering near our booth. Then she leaned in closer. Your daughter's company has been actively moving money for Moretti for at least 2 solid years. We estimate about $6 million annually through fake luxury condo projects. We've been tracking the massive wire transfers, Cayman Islands, Panama, Delaware LLCs. It is textbook, aggressive laundering. Is she complicit or is she being coerced? I asked, my voice tight. I needed to know if I had raised a criminal. We don't know, Diane said bluntly. That's exactly what we're trying to figure out. If she is a willing participant, she is going to federal prison for a very long time. If she's being blackmailed or violently threatened. She trailed off, letting the implication hang heavily in the air. We desperately need more evidence, communications, financial records, internal testimony. If we move in and bust the operation right now, Luca disappears into the wind, and your daughter takes the entire fall alone as the CEO on paper. I sat back against the booth, my mind racing. I thought about Natalie. I thought about the last time I had seen her, 6 months ago at that coffee shop. She had looked exhausted, stressed, terrified. I had chalked it up to the messy divorce she was going through, but maybe it was something entirely different. Maybe she was trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. Let me go undercover, I said, my voice hardening into resolve. Diane's eyes narrowed instantly. Vernon, absolutely not. I will get close to Natalie, I insisted, leaning over the table. I'll find out if she's being coerced. I'll gather the internal evidence you need from the inside. You are fully retired, Diane stated flatly, crossing her arms. And more importantly, she is your daughter. You cannot possibly be objective in this. That is exactly why I have to do this, I shot back, my voice barely a whisper but full of venom. If she is innocent, if she is a victim in this, I will prove it, and I will burn Moretti to the ground. And if she's guilty, I stopped. The words caught in my throat. I swallowed hard, forcing them out. If she is guilty, I'll do what is right. I swear it. Diane studied me for a long, heavy moment. She was weighing the risks, calculating the odds. Then slowly, She closed the manila folder and stood up from the booth. Luca Moretti is incredibly dangerous, she warned, looking down at me. He is not like his father. Tony was a strict businessman, cold, calculated, predictable. Luca is entirely different. He's volatile, he's cruel, and to him this is deeply personal. If he finds out you are actively investigating him, he will come after you. And he won't hesitate to put a bullet in your head. I nodded, my jaw set tight. I understand the risks. Diane placed her hand heavily on my shoulder. Do you? Because the last time I checked, you are 64 years old, Vernon. You are 2 full years out of the field. You don't have a badge, and you don't have a gun. She reached into her blazer pocket and slid a plain, white business card across the table. On it was a single phone number, nothing else, handwritten, completely untraceable. Call me if you need absolutely anything, she instructed. She turned to leave, but paused at the door, looking back over her shoulder. Be very careful, Vernon. Luca has eyes everywhere in this city. I sat in the booth and watched her walk out into the bustling Chicago street. I picked up the small white card, slipped it securely into my leather wallet, and finished the cold dregs of my espresso. Outside, the brutal February wind violently rattled the large glass windows of the coffee shop. Somewhere in this sprawling frozen city, Luca Moretti was sitting in a high-rise, waiting for his revenge. And somewhere much closer, my only daughter was hiding dark secrets I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to uncover. But I was going to rip the truth out into the light, no matter what it cost me. 3 agonizing weeks passed. I spent every single day quietly watching Natalie from a distance. I was a ghost in my own daughter's life. Diane provided me with heavily redacted surveillance photos, encrypted bank records, and thick phone logs. But there was nothing concrete, nothing that proved coercion, just endless, damning patterns. Massive wire transfers processed every Friday afternoon. Shadowy meetings with hard-faced men in expensive Italian suits at high-end steakhouses. Then on a dreary Thursday afternoon, my personal phone rang. It was Natalie. Her voice was soft, almost tentative. I hadn't heard her call me that in months. Dad? She asked. I was thinking, would you like to come over for dinner this Saturday? I really miss you. Every single trained instinct in my body screamed that this was a trap. Criminals don't suddenly invite the retired FBI agent father to a cozy family dinner unless they need something. Or unless they are told to, but she was my daughter, and a foolish, desperate, hopeful part of me wanted to believe she was entirely innocent. I wanted to believe she just missed her old man. I immediately told Diane about the sudden dinner invitation. We met briefly in the freezing shadows of a concrete parking garage off Roosevelt Road. She wasn't happy about it, not one bit. I'll wear a wire, I suggested, leaning against the cold concrete pillar. Not yet, Diane countered, shaking her head. I need to see if she's genuine first. If she finds a wire, the whole operation blows up in our faces. Diane reached into her heavy jacket pocket and pulled out a small, unmarked plastic vial containing a single white pill. At the very least, take this antidote. If you start to feel dizzy, disoriented, or out of body, take it immediately. I looked down at the tiny pill in my palm. You honestly think my own daughter is going to drug me? I think Luca Moretti will, Diane said grimly. And I think your daughter might not have a choice in the matter. I slipped the pill carefully into my shirt pocket. Saturday evening, I drove out to Lincoln Park. Natalie's building was an imposing monolith of sleek glass and cold steel. 15 stories of high-end luxury overlooking the dark expanse of Lake Michigan. It was the kind of place that cost more per month than most honest people made in an entire year. I had never actually asked how she afforded it on a startup real estate developer's salary. I suppose I should have. She opened the door wearing a simple, elegant black sweater dress, her dark hair falling loosely around her shoulders. She smiled. It was the exact same bright, crinkling smile I had seen 1,000 times growing up. At her birthdays, her high school graduation, her wedding day. Dad, I'm so glad you came, she said warmly. I hugged her, and as I pulled her close, I felt her body stiffen slightly. Just for a fraction of a second, a momentary rigidness. Then she relaxed and hugged me back tightly. The apartment was aggressively modern. White leather sofas, a pristine glass coffee table, abstract art hanging on the stark white walls. Massive floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the glittering city, lights stretching infinitely toward the darkening sky. The sunset was painting everything in the room a harsh, bloody orange. From the pristine kitchen came the rich, warm smell of butternut squash soup. It was Elizabeth's famous recipe. I recognized the scent immediately. I learned it from Mom's old cookbook, Natalie said, leading me to the sleek dining table. Do you like it? It's perfect, I said, offering a tight smile. But my active mind was furiously cataloging every single detail in the room. The expensive furniture, the stunning view, the way she moved around the kitchen like she owned the world, or like she was trying very, very hard to pretend she did. She served dinner, hot butternut squash soup, toasted artisanal bread, and a very expensive bottle of Merlot. I ate the soup. It was sweet, creamy, exactly the way Elizabeth used to make it on cold winter nights. For a fleeting moment, I was 20 years younger, sitting at our old cramped kitchen table in Pilsen. Watch Guan's beloved wife laugh at something silly Natalie had said. Then I took a sip of the wine. It tasted slightly bitter at the very back of my throat. How's work, Dad? Natalie asked, leaning forward, resting her chin on her hand. Are you still doing the tax consulting stuff? Yes, I lied smoothly. It's busy season right now. Tax deadlines are coming up fast in April. Do you work every day? Most days. Why? I asked, keeping my tone light. I just worry about you, she said, quickly, her eyes darting away for a second. You're 64 now. You should rest more. I noticed the specific way she asked her questions. They weren't casual. They were deliberate, calculated. What time do you usually leave the office? Dad, do you drive or do you take the train? She was actively mapping my daily routine. She reached across the table and refilled my wine glass. Dad, you barely touched it. Drink up. I took another sip, trying desperately to look relaxed, but my pulse was steadily climbing. Something was very wrong here. Dad, she said suddenly, carefully setting down her silver fork. Have you been feeling okay lately? I'm fine, I said. Why? Mrs. Harris called me last. She said you looked really tired. I froze, the bread turning to ash in my mouth. You talked to Evelyn? She's worried about you, Dad. So am I. Evelyn Harris was my elderly neighbor back in Pilsen. A sweet, 72-year-old woman who was always asking if I needed anything from the grocery store. I hadn't realized she and Natalie were in regular contact. I'm fine, Natalie, just busy. Natalie looked directly at me. Her dark eyes were incredibly hard to read. Was it genuine concern or was it cold, hard calculation? Promise me you'll see a doctor if you feel anything unusual, she pressed. Dizziness, confusion, memory problems. Why in God's name would she say that, unless she already knew something was going to happen to me? I stayed until exactly 9 o'clock. I politely thanked her for dinner. She hugged me at the door, much tighter this time, almost desperate. I love you, Dad. I love you too, I said, and my voice caught because I meant it. I drove home. The neon city lights violently blurred past the windshield. My head suddenly felt incredibly heavy. My hands were trembling slightly when I aggressively gripped the leather steering wheel. I pulled the car over hard on Halsted Street and sat in the dark for a few long minutes, breathing heavily. Was it just the stress of the investigation? Or was it the wine? Was it the soup? I made it back to my apartment by 10 o'clock. The place was pitch dark and freezing cold. I didn't even bother turning on the lights. I collapsed heavily onto the couch, still wearing my thick winter coat, and stared blankly at nothing. My head felt like it was stuffed full of wet cotton. My hands shook violently as I reached into my pocket for my burner phone to text Diane. Made it home, nothing suspicious, but before I could hit send, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My leather wallet was sitting right there on the coffee table. I always keep it in my pocket. Always. I am borderline obsessive about it. 35 years as a federal agent rigorously trained me to never, ever let my ID out of my sight. I had absolutely no memory of taking it out of my pocket. The room suddenly violently tilted on its axis, and then, for just a horrifying, endless moment, I couldn't remember where I had parked my car. 5 long, terrifying days after that dinner, I really started forgetting things. It started with small things at first, the kind of minor lapses you easily excuse as simple fatigue. Forgetting where I had placed my keys, blanking on the name of a client I had worked closely with for months. momentarily losing the route home from the local grocery store. I told myself it was nothing, just stress, just old age creeping in. But on Thursday morning, I woke up and stared at the calendar on my kitchen wall, and I couldn't remember what day it was. March 10th, 2022. The bold red numbers felt entirely foreign, like they belonged to someone else's life. That's when I knew, deep in my gut, that something was horribly wrong. I went through my usual rigid morning routine: 5:30 wake up, brew the coffee, read the Tribune. But when I reached for the heavy bag of coffee grounds, I couldn't remember how many scoops I had already added to the filter. 2? 3? I stared dumbly at the paper filter, trying desperately to recall the simple action I had performed seconds ago. Nothing, complete blank. I sat at the table and aggressively opened the newspaper. I read the exact same paragraph 3 times in a row, and I still couldn't tell you a single word it said. I needed to get to the office. I had a crucial meeting at 10 with a client. I grabbed my wool coat, reached for my car keys on the hook by the door. They weren't there. I meticulously checked the kitchen counter, the dining table, the nightstand. Nothing. My heart started pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I had owned those keys for 12 years. They were on the same heavy metal keychain a small, silver FBI shield Elizabeth had given me as a retirement gift. I never ever misplaced them. I found them 20 agonizing minutes later. They were sitting inside the refrigerator, right next to a carton of milk. I stood there in the cold kitchen, holding the freezing metal keys in my hand, trying to understand how the hell I had put my car keys in the fridge. Had I been distracted? Had I blindly set them down without thinking while grabbing the milk? I couldn't remember. I couldn't picture the moment it happened. My brain was a terrifying void. I finally made it to the office by 10:15. I was late. I am never late. My client was already sitting in the small waiting area. Ronald Carter, 51 years old, a branch manager at First National Bank. We had been working together for 6 months on his complex corporate taxes. Nice guy, reliable. "Good morning, Agent Sullivan," he said casually as I walked in. He stopped dead, realizing his mistake, and smiled awkwardly. "Sorry, I meant Mr. Sullivan." I froze in the doorway. Agent Sullivan. Why on earth had he called me that? Had I accidentally told him I used to be in the FBI? I couldn't remember. 35 years of rigorous psychological training had taught me to always keep my past utterly quiet. It was second nature, but maybe I had slipped. Maybe the careful cover I had built was cracking under the weight of whatever was happening to my brain. "Good morning, Ron," I said, forcing my voice to sound completely normal. We sat down in my office. He started aggressively talking about quarterly projections, tax deductions, complex depreciation schedules. I nodded along, furiously taking notes on a yellow legal pad. But halfway through the meeting, I had to stop and ask him to repeat a key figure we had already discussed in detail last week. He stopped talking and looked at me, genuine concern flickering rapidly across his face. "Mr. Sullivan, are you feeling all right?" Yes, I lied. Just a little tired today. He didn't look convinced. By 5:30 I was done. I aggressively closed up the office and started the drive home. The route was pure muscle memory. West Adams to Roosevelt, Roosevelt to Halsted, Halsted deep into Pilsen. I had driven it 1,000 times in my sleep. But when I reached the busy intersection at Roosevelt and Halsted, I stopped at the red light. I couldn't remember which way to turn, left, right. I sat frozen at the green light, cars aggressively honking behind me, panic rising in my throat like bile. I pulled out my phone and blindly opened Google Maps. The glowing blue dot showed I was exactly 2 miles from my apartment. 2 miles. I had lived in Pilsen for 15 years. I should know this. I should be able to navigate this city blindfolded. I made it home eventually. I parked on the street and sat in the dark, cold car for a very long time, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. My mother had suffered from severe dementia. It started when she was 85, but I was only 64. It was too young, too soon. What the hell was happening to me? I slowly climbed out of the car and walked toward my brick building. That's when I saw her. Mrs. Evelyn Harris was standing on the front concrete steps of the brownstone next door, watering her wilted potted plants. 72 years old, silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, wearing a thick cardigan sweater despite the biting cold. She had been my neighbor for 10 years, always kind, always quietly checking in. The kind of wonderful woman who would bring you hot soup if you were sick and never ask for a single thing in return. "Vernon," she called out, waving her hand. "I've been trying to call you all day." "Oh, sorry, Evelyn," I said, forcing a polite smile. "I've been really busy at the office." She set down the heavy green watering can and walked over to me, her deeply lined face etched with obvious worry. "Are you okay, dear? You look terribly pale, and yesterday, I saw you standing in the hallway for 10 minutes, just staring blankly at your own door." I didn't remember that. At all. Her expression instantly softened into something worse than fear, pity. "Vernon, maybe you should see a doctor. My husband had symptoms exactly like this before." She stopped herself, her eyes darting away. I knew exactly what she was going to say. Her husband, Frank, had passed away 5 years ago. "Aggressive Alzheimer's." "I'm fine, Evelyn," I said gently. "Really, just exhausted from work." She nodded slowly, but I knew she didn't believe a word I said. "If you need anything, you call me, okay?" "I will, thank you." I went inside my apartment, closed the heavy door, and leaned back against it. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. I took off my heavy winter coat and reached deep into the pocket for my phone. My freezing fingers brushed against something else. Something small, something hard plastic. I pulled it out into the dim light of the hallway. An orange plastic pill bottle, no label, no name. Inside were 5 or 6 small, perfectly round white pills. I stared at the bottle, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't remember putting this in my coat pocket. I didn't recognize the pills. I had absolutely no idea where they had come from. Had Natalie given me this? I forced my sluggish brain to think back to Saturday night. The dinner, the wine, the polite conversation. But after that, everything was shattered fragments. The blurry drive home, collapsing on the couch, my wallet sitting inexplicably on the table. Had she slipped this into my coat while I was distracted? Or had I blindly picked it up somewhere and simply forgotten? I aggressively set the bottle on the kitchen counter, walked into the bathroom, flicked on the harsh overhead light, and stared at myself in the mirror. The old man staring back at me looked ancient, terrified, and completely confused. For the first time in 64 years, I didn't recognize myself. And that terrified me significantly more than any armed criminal I had ever chased down a dark alley. 8 days passed, and the suffocating confusion didn't fade. It settled in, quiet, persistent, like a dark parasite that had finally found a comfortable place to live inside my skull. I was sitting at my desk on a Friday morning, staring blankly at a complex tax return on my computer screen, watching the numbers violently blur together. They ran into each other like cheap watercolor paint in the rain. I blinked hard, vigorously rubbed my burning eyes, and pressed my cold palms against my face. Then I looked up and froze. Elizabeth was standing in the doorway of my office. She was wearing the navy blue cardigan I had bought her for our 30th anniversary. The one with the small pearl button she loved so much. Her hair was dark again, entirely untouched by the gray that had begun to appear just before she got terribly sick. She smiled at me. It was the exact same soft, deeply knowing smile that used to make the worst days feel completely manageable. "Vernon," she said gently, her voice echoing perfectly in the small room. "You're working too hard again, sweetheart." I stood up so fast, my heavy office chair violently scraped across the floor. I reached out for her, my chest incredibly tight, my throat closing up in a sob. But as my hand moved toward her, she vanished into thin air. The doorway was completely empty. The dim hallway beyond was silent. My hands shook violently as I slowly sat back down, aggressively gripping the sharp edge of the desk, forcing my lungs to draw breath. It wasn't real. She wasn't real. Elizabeth had been gone for 3 years, I knew that. The horrifying fact that my brain had forgotten it, even for a second, terrified me more than anything Luca Moretti could ever do. By noon, I had completely missed a scheduled client meeting. Someone I had been working with closely for 6 months. He called twice and left a concerned voicemail asking if I was okay. I had absolutely no memory of making the appointment. But when I frantically checked my desk calendar, there it was, written clearly in my own distinct handwriting. 12 p.m. James Rivera, Q1 review. I called him back immediately, profusely apologized, rescheduled for Monday, and blamed a sudden bout of the flu. He was highly understanding, but his concern was incredibly obvious. "Are you absolutely sure you're all right, Mr. Sullivan?" I lied again and said yes, but I wasn't all right. I was rapidly losing time. I was losing massive pieces of myself, and I had no idea how to stop the bleeding. That evening, I went home early, completely skipped dinner, and sat in the pitch-dark living room with a tall glass of water I never once touched. The apartment felt suffocatingly quiet, like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to finally break. I replayed the vivid hallucination again and again in my mind. Elizabeth's loving face, her gentle voice, the way she had perfectly said my name. I desperately wanted to pick up the burner phone and call Diane. I wanted to tell her everything. But if I admitted to a federal agent that I was actively seeing things that weren't there, she would instantly pull me off the case. She would have to. Protocol demanded it. And I couldn't let that happen, not with Natalie so deeply tangled up in Moretti's violent world. So I sat in the dark, desperately trying to convince myself I was fine, until my phone suddenly rang. It was Mrs. Harris. "Vernon, dear. I hope I'm not bothering you," she said gently. "I saw you come home early today, and you really didn't look well. Are you feeling okay?" I quickly told her I was just tired. She didn't believe me for a second. "I know you," she said firmly. "You don't ever slow down unless something is very wrong. Have you seen a doctor?" I deflected, thanked her repeatedly, and promised I'd take better care of myself. After we hung up, I stared at the dark phone, wondering exactly how much she had noticed. How much everyone had noticed. 2 hours later it rang again. This time, it was Natalie. "Dad," she said, her voice tight with anxiety. "Mrs. Harris just called me. She's incredibly worried about you. She says you've been forgetting things, getting lost in the building." My chest tightened painfully. I hadn't known she had Natalie's personal number. "I'm fine," I said dismissively. "Just a really busy week at the office." "Don't do that," Natalie said, her voice cracking loudly over the speaker. "I saw it too. You completely forgot where you parked your car. You left your wallet at my place. That's not you, Dad." She was entirely right, and I had absolutely nothing to argue with. "I really think you need to see a doctor," she pleaded. "Just to check, please. Will you do that for me?" I closed my eyes in the dark room and nodded slowly, even though she couldn't see me. "I promise." Relief instantly flooded her voice. "I'll call tomorrow to make sure you made the appointment." "I love you, Dad. I love you too." After the call ended, I sat in the darkness for a very long time, wondering if I had just made the biggest, most fatal mistake of my entire life. The very next morning, I picked up the phone and called a high-end medical clinic located in the Gold Coast. I scheduled a priority appointment for that exact afternoon. I told the receptionist I had been having some concerning memory issues. "Nothing serious," I lied, "just minor concerns." She swiftly booked me with Dr. Alan Prescott, a renowned neurologist with over 20 years of clinical experience. At exactly 2 o'clock, I sat rigidly in a pale blue waiting room, watching an analog clock tick far too loudly on the wall. When the nurse finally called my name, I followed her down a sterile hallway into an exam room that smelled strongly of sharp antiseptic and underlying uncertainty. Dr. Prescott arrived mere minutes later. He had distinguished silver hair, thin wire-rimmed glasses, and incredibly calm, reassuring eyes. He listened patiently as I detailed the forgetfulness and the intense confusion. I didn't mention Elizabeth. I didn't mention the mysterious pills, and I certainly didn't mention Luca Moretti. He ran a series of standardized cognitive tests. I stumbled through them, he noticed. When he completely finished the evaluation, he folded his hands on his desk and met my gaze. "Mr. Sullivan," he said carefully, his voice a practiced whisper. "What you're describing could very well be early-stage dementia." The heavy word hit me like a runaway freight train. "How soon can we know for sure?" I asked. "With a comprehensive MRI and extensive blood work," he said. "About a week." I agreed to absolutely everything and walked out of the clinic, feeling like the solid ground beneath me had completely vanished. Monday afternoon, Natalie personally drove me to Dr. Prescott's private office. The building looked like it belonged on the glossy cover of an architectural magazine. All sheer glass and polished steel, exuding the kind of quiet, intimidating money that didn't need to loudly announce itself. She waited anxiously in the expansive lobby, gripping her phone and a cup of coffee, while I took the private elevator to the 8th floor, entirely alone. The receptionist smiled at me, like she had been rigorously trained to handle the fragile, and led me down a carpeted hallway that smelled faintly of lavender and expensive leather. Dr. Alan Prescott was significantly younger than I had expected from his credentials. Mid-50s, salt and pepper hair, and a voice so unnervingly calm it could have talked a desperate jumper off a ledge. He gestured politely to an oversized leather chair across from his massive mahogany desk, and I sat down heavily. "Mr. Sullivan," he began, meticulously folding his hands on top of a yellow legal pad. "Your daughter told me you've been experiencing some serious difficulties. Sudden memory lapses, intense confusion, spatial disorientation. Why don't you walk me through exactly what's been happening?" So I did. I played the part. I told him about putting the car keys in the refrigerator. I told him about the disastrous client meeting. I told him how I had completely forgotten the drive home, how I couldn't remember which street I lived on in a neighborhood I knew like the back of my hand. And then, because he gently prodded, and because I needed to sell the story, I told him about Elizabeth. About seeing her vividly in the doorway of my office. Hearing her voice, reaching out for her, before she disappeared like cigarette smoke in the wind. "Did you believe she was real?" he asked, his expensive pen hovering over the legal pad. I swallowed hard, acting the part of the broken man. No, I knew she wasn't, but in that horrific moment, it felt real, more real than anything else. He wrote something down with quick, sharp strokes, nodding slowly. "Is there any family history of severe cognitive decline?" "Alzheimer's, dementia?" "My mother," I said quietly. "She had Alzheimer's, diagnosed at 85, died 2 years later." He made another quick note, then looked up at me, with an expression I couldn't quite read. Sympathy, maybe. Or perhaps cold pity. I wasn't entirely sure which was worse. "I'd like to run a few cognitive tests right now," he said smoothly, setting the pad aside. Nothing invasive, just some simple exercises to establish a medical baseline. I nodded, and he methodically walked me through them. First, he gave me 3 random words to remember: apple, table, penny. He told me he'd ask me to repeat them later. Then he handed me a blank sheet of paper and a pen, and asked me to draw an analog clock showing exactly 10:15. I drew the crude circle. I added the numbers. I placed the hands exactly where I thought they belonged. When I handed it back to him, he studied it in silence for a long moment, then deliberately set it face down on the desk. "Now," he said softly, "I'd like you to count backward from 100 by sevens." I started 193, 86, 79, 72. My brain genuinely felt sluggish, like I was trying to wade through thick mud. 65, 58. I paused, artificially hesitating. He waited silently. 51. I finished, but I could clearly tell from the slight tightening of his jaw that I had taken far too long. "Good," he said, though his flat tone suggested the exact opposite. "Now, can you repeat those 3 words I gave you earlier?" I closed my eyes, reaching for them in the dark. Apple, that one came easy. Table, that one too. But the 3rd word, I legitimately couldn't find it. I sat there in suffocating silence, my jaw tight, my hands clenched into fists in my lap. Finally, I shook my head in defeat. 2 out of 3, I said. He wrote that down immediately. "The word was penny," he said gently. I felt something fundamental crack inside me, Doctor. Prescott set his pen down, leaned back in his expensive leather chair, and looked at me with the kind of incredibly careful, measured expression doctors reserve for delivering terminal news. "Mr. Sullivan," he said slowly, enunciating every syllable, "based heavily on your reported symptoms and the definitive results of these clinical tests, I believe you are experiencing early-stage dementia, potentially accompanied by paranoid hallucinations." The clinical words landed like a brutal punch to the gut. I stared at him, my mind racing a mile a minute, my heart pounding aggressively against my ribs. "Dementia," I repeated, my voice barely above a raspy whisper. "I'm 64 years old. Early-onset dementia can absolutely occur in patients as young as their 50s, he said smoothly, his tone shifting to professional and clinical. "It's not common, but it's not unheard of, especially with a documented family history like yours. He pulled out a crisp prescription pad, quickly scribbled something I couldn't read from where I sat, tore off the small sheet, and handed it across the desk to me. I'm prescribing a mild sedative to help manage the severe hallucinations. It should also significantly help with the anxiety and the spatial confusion. Take 1 tablet at night with food. We'll schedule a follow-up in exactly 2 weeks to closely monitor your progress. I looked down at the paper. The handwriting was nearly illegible, standard doctor scrawl, but I could make out part of the drug name. Something ending in done. I folded it carefully, slipped it into my suit pocket, and stood up. "Thank you, doctor," I said, keeping my voice utterly flat. He stood too, firmly shook my hand, and walked me to the heavy oak door. But as I stepped out into the carpeted hallway, I heard his voice again. It was low, muffled, speaking urgently to someone on his office phone. I stopped dead in my tracks. The heavy door hadn't fully closed behind me. "Yes, I've just examined him," Prescott said quietly into the receiver. "The diagnosis is fully confirmed. He's exhibiting absolutely all the symptoms you described." A long pause. "No, he doesn't suspect a thing. I'll send the official medical report over tonight." I felt my blood run absolutely ice cold. All the symptoms you described. Someone had given this esteemed doctor a script. Someone had explicitly told him exactly what to look for, what to officially diagnose, and how to permanently bury me under a mountain of medical paperwork. I didn't wait to hear another word. I walked briskly to the elevator, jammed the button, and rode down to the expansive lobby in total silence, my mind spinning violently out of control. When I finally got home, I went straight to the refrigerator. I pulled out the Tupperware container of butternut squash soup Natalie had made for me 3 weeks ago. I carefully, meticulously transferred a small sample of it into a sterile plastic Ziploc bag. Then I picked up my burner phone and rapidly dialed Diane Foster. "I need your lab to run an emergency toxicology screen on this immediately," I said the second she answered. "Check for risperidone, heavy benzodiazepines, anything that could synthetically cause severe memory loss and vivid hallucinations." "Vernon," she said carefully, "what the hell is going on?" "I'll explain when I see you." "Can you meet me tonight?" 9 o'clock. The underground parking garage at the field office. "I'll be there at 9 sharp. I pulled into the dim concrete cavern beneath the FBI's Chicago field office on West Roosevelt Road. Diane was already waiting near the service elevator, her arms firmly crossed. I handed her the Ziploc bag containing the soup. 3 days later, my burner phone buzzed at 1:47 in the morning. "Meet me now," Diane said. I drove through the empty streets back to the garage. Diane stepped out of her SUV and handed me a thick folder. "FBI laboratory analysis," she said, her voice grim. "Substance detected. Risperidone, high concentration. It's a powerful antipsychotic. Side effects include extreme confusion, sudden memory loss, and vivid hallucinations." My hands shook. "She drugged me, someone did," Diane corrected sharply, "but we don't think it was her idea. We intercepted a call. Luca Moretti is ruthlessly blackmailing Natalie. He has some kind of video on her, something bad enough that she's willing to risk everything to keep it hidden. He forced her to launder his money, and when you started getting too close, he forced her to file for conservatorship. If she controls you, she silences you. She isn't a criminal mastermind, Vernon. She's a terrified victim." I felt something shatter inside my chest. My daughter, my Natalie. I had spent weeks thinking she was the enemy, but she was just scared, trapped. "Let her take me to court," I said, my voice hardening into steel. "Let her file the papers. Let Prescott testify. Let Luca think he's won. And when the time is absolutely right, I will expose every single piece of this in open court." Diane handed me a small encrypted USB drive. 6 months of our surveillance, bank records, wire transfers, photos, everything you need. 4 days later, the trap sprang shut. A process server showed up at my door with the emergency conservatorship petition. And 5 weeks after that, I found myself sitting in courtroom 506, staring down Judge Pierce, listening to my daughter call me insane. Which brings us right back to where we started. Judge Pierce looked down at me from the bench, the courtroom completely silent after Charles Mitchell's devastating opening arguments. "Mr. Sullivan," the judge said softly, his eyes boring into mine. Do you have absolutely anything you wish to say in your defense? I stood up slowly. 47 pairs of eyes turned to watch me. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out my battered, silver FBI badge. I held it up high so everyone in the room could see it clearly. Your Honor, I said, my voice booming across the courtroom. My name is Vernon Sullivan, and I am a retired special agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The courtroom violently erupted. Gasps, shouts. The reporters in the back scrambled for their phones. Judge Pierce slammed his gavel down, demanding order. Natalie stared at me, her jaw completely dropped, her eyes wide with absolute shock. Charles Mitchell looked like he was going to be physically sick. And in the third row of the gallery, Luca Moretti's arrogant smile instantly vanished. Your Honor, I am not suffering from dementia, I continued, my voice slicing through the noise. I have been deliberately and systematically drugged with risperidone to discredit me and silence my active investigation into a massive money laundering operation run by that man right there, Luca Moretti. I pointed directly at Luca. Every head snapped toward him. He sat frozen. Mr. Moretti has been viciously blackmailing my daughter, forcing her to launder $72 million through her company. Dr. Alan Prescott, the man who just testified against me, is on Moretti's payroll for $20,000 a month. He falsified my medical diagnosis. I pulled the USB drive from my pocket and held it up. I have the evidence right here. 6 months of FBI surveillance, financial records, and the laboratory results proving I was drugged. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom suddenly burst open. Diane Foster marched in, flanked by 6 heavily armed FBI agents in tactical gear. The room went dead silent. She walked straight down the aisle, her eyes locked on Luca Moretti. Luca Moretti, she announced clearly, you are under arrest for money laundering, racketeering conspiracy, and witness intimidation. Agents grabbed him, pulling his arms behind his back. Luca screamed, thrashing wildly, You think this is over, old man? She's going down with me. No, I said quietly, watching them drag him away. She's not. Diane turned to the second row. Dr. Alan Prescott, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud. Chaos reigned. As the FBI cleared the criminals from the room, Judge Pierce slammed his gavel one final time. He looked down at me, a deep respect in his eyes. He remembered the man who had saved his daughter from a burning car 24 years ago. Case dismissed, he announced. Mr. Sullivan is of sound mind and body. I looked across the aisle at Natalie. She was sobbing uncontrollably, her face buried in her hands. She finally understood. I hadn't been losing my mind. I had been fighting to save her life. The assistant U.S. attorney stepped forward and offered Natalie a deal. Full cooperation in exchange for 3 years of supervised probation. No prison time. Natalie looked at me, her eyes begging for guidance. I nodded. She took the deal. 3 years later, I stood outside the Cook County Probation Office on a warm Monday morning in May. The heavy glass doors opened, and Natalie walked out. She was 39 now, quieter, steadier. She had finished her 1,000 hours of community service, working at a housing shelter. She stopped when she saw me leaning against my car. Dad, what are you doing here? Thought you might want a ride, I said, smiling. She got into the passenger seat, and we drove in silence for a while. Finally, she looked over at me, tears welling in her eyes. I'm so sorry, Dad, for not believing you, for thinking you were sick. I almost destroyed you. I pulled the car over, put it in park, and took her hand. You were terrified, Nat. You were manipulated by a monster. You did what you thought you had to do to survive. And in your own way, you were trying to protect me. You're my daughter. I would do it all again to save you. She broke down crying and I just held her. The betrayal had cut incredibly deep, but as we sat there in the car, I knew we were finally going to be okay. And to you listening to this story, remember this. I spent 26 years chasing criminals, convinced I was protecting my family by keeping the world safe. But I forgot the most important truth. The people you love need your presence, not just your protection. I missed the quiet moments that build unbreakable trust. And when my daughter needed me most, she didn't come to me because I had taught her that work always came first. Don't be like me. Don't let your career or your pride steal the time you have with the people who matter. Family betrayal doesn't happen overnight. It's built slowly through missed calls and broken promises. But betrayal can be healed if both people are willing to fight for it. If you found this story meaningful, please leave a comment below and tell me, have you ever had to choose between justice and family? Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel for more real-life lessons. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. God bless you. And remember, it's never too late to come home.